us online, or you're watching later. I mean, that you're welcome still, very much so. So I'm again very glad that you're here. Of course, as you know, this program tonight is the closing program for the 2023 series, Holocaust Learn and Remember. And this program tonight features second-generation Holocaust survivor, Anna Salton Eisen. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and with your son as well. We're so glad that you're here to share your knowledge and experiences. I really want to thank so many people that make this program possible. As many of you know, this is the 11th year we've had this series of programs at the San Antonio Public Library, and it really takes a lot of people's efforts to make this possible. I'll mention just a few. The Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, of course, is a key partner, along with the Jewish Federation of San Antonio, the San Antonio Public Library Foundation, the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, of course, Howie Nestel and Chuckmatic Advertising, co-founding the program with our director, Ramiro Salazar, who unexpectedly could not be here this evening. He was really hoping to be here this evening. Leslie Davis Met, Dr. Jessica Hanshaw and Allison King of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Morgan Yoshimura from the San Antonio Public Library, and all the staff who work with her. It really takes all of them and many more to make this series of programs possible every year. As soon as we finish, sometimes before we finish the month of programs, we're starting on planning the next year's series. So if you have ideas about that, you can talk to anybody here that's with the library or the museum. Before I introduce, we just learned moments ago that the source on KSTX, the public radio station, at noon tomorrow is having a program, The Rise of Anti-Semitism in Texas. That will be live at noon, and then they rebroadcast it, I believe, at 7. So I just thought, everyone here might be interested in that program as well. So once again, welcome. We're glad that you're here, and I would like to then introduce Dr. Jessica Hanshaw, Education and Curations Manager at the Holocaust Museum of San Antonio, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening. I am honored to introduce our speaker this evening. She's become a wonderful friend and partner of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we're always happy to have her join us here in San Antonio. Anna Salton Eisen was a founding member and the first president of Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. She has conducted extensive research into the Holocaust and spoken on that topic to school and community groups. She served as a docent for the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, now the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and conducted Holocaust survivor interviews for the USC Shoah Foundation. Anna is an ambassador to the hashtag Every Name Counts, a digital initiative of the Arleston Archives, the world's most comprehensive archive on the victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. A licensed social worker, Salton Eisen formerly practiced as a therapist, specializing in mental health and trauma. At this time, please welcome Anna Salton Eisen.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and if I can turn on the clicker, I'll be happy to get started. And I did it. So let me start by saying that I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I apologize for looking this way, but I have to pick one screen to look at so I know what the slides are. But I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. My father, whose story I mostly share, was in 10 concentration camps from the age of 14 to 17. When he finally started speaking about the Holocaust, he said to me that while he was in the camps during those long and terrible years, he and his fellow prisoners, who became friends, who helped each other stay alive by sharing their bread and encouragement, made a promise to each other that one day, if any of them would survive, that they would go forward and tell the story of what they had experienced and what they had witnessed. And that the dream was, and the wish is, that one day good people like yourselves, without fear in your heart, would gather together to learn and remember and to care. And if that would happen, it would be a great miracle. And by coming here tonight and joining me to learn and remember and care, you are a part of that miracle. So I first want to say thank you for coming. So growing up, I didn't really know anything about the Holocaust. I didn't know its name. My father never spoke about it, nor my mother. And I was born in upstate New York, and about the time I was 5 years old, we moved to the Maryland suburbs. And I began to realize that we were different. My parents spoke many languages. They had a foreign accent. We had no photographs of family in the house because, well, on my father's side especially, we had no family. But I began to hear words about the war, about the camp. And when I would ask my father about his background or about his family, he would get a look of anguish. And he would say, let's not talk about it. And I knew, even as a child, that I had struck a chord with something very painful. So I learned to keep quiet and not ask any questions. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I was in the den of our home looking for a deck of playing cards, and I reached my hand into an end table drawer and pulled out 2 stiff pieces of paper. They were watercolor paintings. This was the first. It was signed by an L. Zaltzman, and on the other side said Neustadt, although I didn't know how to pronounce it at the time, with the number, now I know it was the year, 46. I'd never seen anything in a textbook or storybook that prepared me to see such a sight, so vibrant and terrifying, but I knew and could see that there were soldiers and people injured or dead, and I knew I had found something that I wasn't supposed to see. The second painting was equally frightening and upsetting. Here a young man kneeling before a pit of bodies with a soldier holding a gun to his head. They were both signed by an L. Zaltzman, a name I didn't know. But I knew enough to put them back, not say anything, and indeed I never spoke about these paintings that I had found for nearly 30 years. So I kept my father's and my family's secret. I would go by myself into the library and look for books about World War II. I remember finding a book that had a black and white photo of bodies being bulldozed, and I wondered, is this the secret? Is this my family? It wasn't until I moved to Texas in 1984, where they had a Holocaust museum, that my questions were answered. Not only did I learn all about Hitler and Nazism, I ended up becoming a docent at the museum. Then I went on to do the Spielberg interviews, and it was while doing those that I realized that I didn't want it to be a stranger asking my father what had happened to him, that I wanted it to be me. So I went when I was about in my early 30s and confronted him. Here is his answer in a poem that I had published. This is part of it. Creation. My father says he is Adam. Nothing came before him. I stand behind my father, push him back, explain the savage scar, the broken teeth, the fear of cold and loneliness. Take me to the graves and down the railroad tracks. I told my father that all I knew about the grandmother I was named after was that she died in a gas chamber, and that wasn't enough. I asked him if he would possibly think about going and taking us to Poland. And being the wonderful and gracious and loving father he was, he said yes. And in 2 weeks, my family was on a plane, with my father as our guide. We would go to all the major sites to learn about what happened during the Holocaust, to Warsaw, to the ghetto, to the major cities, but also travel farther east, as he would say, into the den of the beast, to go to the town he was born in and lived in, to the city where he had been in the ghetto. We went to Poland and visited Auschwitz-Birkenau. Here on the left, we walked along the railroad tracks that brought the prisoners into the camp, where 1.1 million Jews were killed, including more than 232,000 children. Those who were not killed immediately were sent to work. And I took this photo inside a barracks, and I couldn't even try to imagine what it would be like in the winter, climbing this shoddy man-made ladder, sleeping without blankets or pillows, without proper clothes in the long, bitter winters. We visited empty and desecrated synagogues throughout Poland, here in one where you see cutouts of Jews in prayer, trying to explain what it was like one time before all the Jews were murdered. There was my family sitting in the front rows in this empty synagogue. We went to markets where we saw these wooden little souvenirs for sale. It was horrific. Jews with the stereotypical features, holding musical instruments, prayer books, and yes, coins and bags of money. The old stereotypes are still alive and well and for sale in the markets in Poland. We returned to my father's town. On the far left, we walked in front of the old yellow building that had been his elementary school. Down the streets, we came to many houses. Here, he said, were my friends. The Tuchmans lived here, as he remembered the memories of that town and what had happened there. And then we went, even though he was scared and said he wouldn't do it, we ended up twice on 2 trips going into his former home, meeting the new owners who were renovating the house and renting out the rooms like a boarding house. Inside the city hall, we were welcomed, and we went upstairs, and in a closet, they had remnants of the Jewish gravestones chopped off and left. And we were shocked to find a box of drawings from the Jewish children that was left from before the war, and among them we found one signed by his friend, Tuchman. We walked down the streets and near the creek where he told me his family had gone at night to hide all night long when the Germans came to town to arrest or beat up or kill the Jews. Slowly, I began to learn all about my father and my family's past. My father was the artist of those watercolor paintings. Even though I was in my 30s, I hadn't ever learned that his real name was Lucien Zaltzman. Here he is in one of the only few photos that we have of his family. My father as a baby, my grandfather Herman, who was a lawyer, my grandmother Anna, that I'm named after, and my father's older brother, Monik. In 2004, after his memoir came out and he started speaking, he also started drawing again. And here he was telling the story of what he had been through, witnessed, and experienced. This is a drawing of his town. He remembers Jewish children and other children playing in the streets, people on the way to synagogue, a life that was quiet and simple and felt safe and happy. But in September 1st, 1939, when the Germans arrived, everything changed. All of these are his original drawings, now housed at Yad Vashem and at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. At first, he said the Germans came and arrested all of the Jewish leaders and men, including my grandfather, who was held and tortured in a Gestapo prison for nearly 6 months. Jews over the age of 13 were forced to wear white armbands with the Jewish Star of David, and often had to do humiliating and cruel and ridiculous, useless things, like we see here, where he remembers the women being forced to scrub the streets with brushes or toothbrushes. They went into the synagogues and they took out the Torah scrolls that contain the 5 books from the Hebrew Bible and set them on fire. And then, one day, after 2 years of occupation, a great time where the Nuremberg laws in Germany had been instituted, where Jews couldn't go to school, couldn't work, couldn't have weapons, couldn't have radios, couldn't have typewriters, couldn't have pets. All and everything that made them human, all of their rights were taken away. There were orders posted throughout the town that within a week, all the Jews would have to gather in the square and carry whatever belongings they had left and be marched to Rzeszów, a nearby city where they had established a ghetto. From all the people of the nearby towns, 23,000 Jews would be in this ghetto. Once there, nearby, Daimler-Benz, the maker of Mercedes, had taken over a factory and was now using it to make aircraft engines. Because a lot of Poles had fled, because there was great hunger in the country, they didn't have enough workers. So Daimler-Benz got permission to get approximately 500 Jews to work in the factory. Among those selected was my father and his brother. All the rest of the Jews in the ghetto in the first week of July in 1942 were put on boxcars, told the lie that they were going to abandon farms where there would be plenty of room and food, but instead they traveled just a short distance to the nearby Belzec extermination camp, where on the same day they arrived, they were gassed and killed. The camp was open 11 months and more than 500,000 people were killed there. Thus began my father's odyssey as being one of the 465 Daimler-Benz Jews that was left behind in the ghetto. Soon they built a factory there and barracks, and that factory became a concentration camp. My father remembers being there and sweeping the streets and doing hard labor. His brother, who was working in another part of the camp, he would go and see him sometimes and stand outside a window. But one day he wasn't there. And a few days later, my father received a note from a Polish worker from his brother saying, "I have escaped to join the resistance in the woods." On occasion, he would get a few notes, but eventually a final note came that said, "It is no longer safe for me to contact you. We will meet after the war by contacting the one relative that they both knew who had gotten out and gotten to New York City in America." But at one point, the SS took over the factory and said, "No more Jewish workers." So all 465 were put on boxcars and sent out. The next camp that they went to was Plaszow, right near Krakow, made famous in the movie Schindler's List. This camp was built on the grounds of 2 Jewish cemeteries, where my father drew and remembered digging up the Jewish graves with shovels or sometimes his bare hands. After a while, they left there and were sent to Wieliczka. Here my father labored in these salt mines. From Wieliczka, they were sent to Flossenburg. Gotta slow down. They were sent to Flossenburg, where my father labored in the stone quarries. Here in this drawing, he remembers and speaks that if the people were too weak to do the work, they might be killed on the spot. My father in this and many photographs included his own prisoner number. On the far left, the prisoner bent over with some kind of a shovel or a stick. On his leg has the number 16,019. This is my father's Flossenburg prisoner number. From Flossenburg, they were put on trains and sent to France. There was an abandoned tunnel near Colmar in Orbis, and the Nazis came and Daimler-Benz, and they put all of the factory equipment into this tunnel. Beyond the opening was the size of a football field. And still to this date, it's painted on the walls by one of the former prisoners. Here worked 462 Jews from Poland, because at that point 3 had died. But as the Allies came, the factory was destroyed, and the remaining prisoners were again put on boxcars. They would be sent back into Germany. The next camp they went to was Sachsenhausen. Here my father draws and remembers this terrible scene that he witnessed time and time again. French resistant prisoners, not Jews, manacled and forced to walk in a circle with a T on their forehead that stands for Tod in German, which means death. And at the end of every day, one prisoner would be selected to be hung. And the next day, they would have to go out and participate in this useless and cruel torture again and again. From Sachsenhausen, they went to Wattenstadt. Here, they would be split into 2 groups. Another prisoner approached my father, a prisoner named Joseph Singer, and he pleaded with my father to change places with him so he could stay with his friends or family. And so my father agreed, and they changed uniforms, and for a short while, my father became Joseph Singer. Joseph Singer, who took my father's name, did not survive the war. And recently, as maybe 6 months ago, I finally cleared up with Yad Vashem that my father, named Lucian Zaltziman, had survived. So my father went to Braunschweig, and after being there a short while, again they were sent out, 10 camps over 3 years, to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was primarily a women's camp, the largest women's camp, but they had a small sub-camp, a transit camp for men. Here my father remembers that at this point there was no work, hardly any food, and the prisoners were dying in great numbers every day. They would lay there and look across the wire at the women prisoners and hope that somehow they felt pity for them. This is one of the only times in the Holocaust that it is recorded that Jewish prisoners received any Red Cross rations. A delegation of Swedes had come as the war was ending, trying to negotiate and trade to release some prisoners. This didn't happen. But there was one day a German guard who allowed them, as they were leaving the camp again, to get some rations. My father was so weak he couldn't carry a box, he couldn't carry a can, but he did get some crackers, some powdered cheese, some powdered milk, some cigarettes that he would trade and use to try and stay alive. And from this camp, he went to the final camp, Veblen. Veblen was a subcamp of Neuengamme, which is in northern Germany. This was a camp that was only open in its entirety for 10 weeks. During that time, 1,000 prisoners died. When my father arrived, the camp wasn't finished. Most of the barracks had no doors, no windows, and indeed in this photograph you can see there were not even bunks to sleep on. They slept in the mud and on the straw on the floor. But on the night of May 1st, 1945, they were put on the trains one more time. But the trains didn't leave. This hadn't happened before. They sat there all night, and on the morning of May 2nd, they were ordered out of the trains. They walked back into the camp, and the German guards were in the towers shooting at them. And my father speaks of running and trying to hide and lie in the dirt among the weeds to try and not get killed. And all of a sudden it was quiet. And as he looked up, he saw that the guard towers were empty. And then he heard the sound of what sounded like horses running, a beating on the ground. But what it was the prisoners running in one direction in their wooden shoes. And that day, when there was no more food and no more hope, a great miracle happened. A group of 7 or 8 American soldiers of the 82nd Airborne, the 504th, had arrived. They had found the camp accidentally, cut the wire, and my father and the other prisoners were now free. This is a photograph of my father, second from the right, taken by a soldier turned photographer of the 504th Unit on May 2nd, 1945. It's now in a book that I'll mention to you that is a pictorial history of the 82nd Airborne and the day they liberated that camp. My father would spend 2 years in displaced person camps because he had not been able to reach his uncle. He would give notes and letters to all these American soldiers. He didn't have an address. And eventually, after 2 years, he got this exact telegram on the right saying, "We will take you to us." And here from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, highest, was his papers in lieu of a passport saying that he would be traveling in 1947 on the USS Marine Flasher from Bremen to New York. Here's the ship manifest, and we even have a little drawing that he kept all his life from that day. We're still an artist, you know, without any training and only a 5th grade education. He recorded the journey, and that is a photo of him taken on the ship. I don't have the picture here today, but at one time he mentioned that there was a photographer on the ship from Look magazine. And through the Library of Congress, I was able to find the magazine and the negative to develop that picture that I now have. And I finally found the magazine with his picture in it on the ship standing behind the captain. He came to the United States with a 5th grade education, 19 years old. And after working some odd jobs, he was, as a permanent resident, drafted and served in the U.S. Army. He went from the barracks and uniforms and roll call of the camps to the barracks and uniform and roll call in the Army. And it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to him. He became an American citizen. He felt welcomed, respected, and he felt that he had a new home and partner in this country. He met and married my mother, who was also a Holocaust survivor. And then using the GI Bill, he went from 5th grade to college, where he earned a bachelor's in physics and a master's in engineering, and began a long career at the Pentagon. Together, we wrote his memoir, The 23rd Psalm. This is the new 20th anniversary edition with a foreword written by Michael Berenbaum, who curated the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And actually, the book last week was just became a finalist. They were named as a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, which was a great honor. There was 1 winner, 3 finalists, and overall in the number of categories, they had over 700 books. So I'm sorry that my father was not alive to see that, but we're very honored to be able to keep his story going. We had these incredible coincidences or miracles that happened. We wanted to have my father's liberation photo in the book. And at the time, University of Wisconsin Press said they needed to see the book in order to check for permissions. This is the book called The Devils in Baggy Pants, which was the nickname that the Germans gave to the American parachutists because they would jump out of the planes with these baggy pants. And in that book, the permissions editor at Wisconsin discovered that her father, Staff Sergeant William P. Walsh, was one of the 7 soldiers who liberated my father. So we went with CNN for a reunion, I guess you call it. It was our first meeting. And lo and behold, one of the sons had the Nazi flag that his father had cut down from the camp the day he liberated my father. Where I live in Colleyville, Texas, I heard about this man, I read about him in the paper, named Lieutenant Colonel James McGillis, but he, by people who know him and love him, was called Maggie. He was, and still remains, the most highly decorated veteran of the 82nd Airborne, and a Medal of Honor nominee he still is. So I heard about him and contacted him and introduced my father to him, and they became friends. They even traveled, as in this picture, back to the Veblen camp, where they had met across the barbed wire for a special ceremony on the Liberation Day. This is a picture of the last time I saw Maggie, and he was 101. He died when he was 103, but because of COVID, his funeral was delayed until just this past Labor Day, where I went to Arlington National Cemetery and took this picture. I know my father would have wanted me to go or be there himself to pay last respects to this great friend and American hero. My father passed away in 2016, but since then, and actually since I first became involved in learning about the Holocaust more than 30 years ago, I have been speaking in schools and doing everything I can to preserve the truth in history and fight hate. I learned about the Arlington Nazi Archives, the greatest and largest repository of Nazi documents, and began searching online and had them do a search. I looked up my father's name, Lucian Zaltzman, with a variety of spellings, but it was always his date of birth, his father's name, and his hometown. And I started making incredible discoveries. Here, my father's list on a Ravensbrück prisoner list, on an original German list from the Flossenburg concentration camp with my father's number 16,019. An unbelievable, beautiful handwriting on this list from France, where my father was prisoner number 33,339, Lucian Zaltzman, date of birth January 7th, 1928. And on all of these lists, they sometimes had his town that he was born in, but I also, recognized through the various spellings that it was him. There was a post-war card that listed the 10 camps he was in with many of the prisoner numbers. In the first camp, he had a very low number, 222. Remember that number, because he was one of only 465. Other discoveries I made searching online. A hand-drawn map. On the side, the person had written Ravaruska, which was a town, Belzhitz, and other places. And it just is very stirring to me to see, in the time before computers, that they had to sit and draw out a map and fill almost every spot with the camps and ghettos. According to the U.S. Holocaust Museum Encyclopedia, there are more than 44,000 concentration camps, death camps, sub-camps, ghettos, and places in over 20 countries where this occurred. On the cover of the Flossenburg list that holds my father's name, another post-war list, I saw here some comments that were written by an American soldier that says, if a thought is to be interjected, it is hoped that these documents will prove of help to those who suffered and to the all who want to prevent a recurrence of such suffering, and that it shall never in the future again be necessary to report such history. Here a soldier on his own just felt moved to write how he had been affected and what his own hope was. And I was shocked to discover from the Veblen camp, the last camp my father was in, the bread list from his last day. Across the top, it has the end of April, May 1st, and on May 2nd, the day he was liberated, the column is empty. On that day, there was no bread. On that day, there was freedom. And I learned more about my father's story since his passing with my research. When they boarded the trains on May 1st, all of the prisoners from Neuengamme and all the subcamps, including Veblen, were destined to be sent to Lübeck Bay. There, a famous, terrible thing happened. They were loaded on 2 ships, that were mistakenly sunken by the British, and 6,000 prisoners drowned, were burned to death, or shot trying to swim to shore. My father was supposed to be among them. When my mother came to live with me a few years ago, and we sold her house, we discovered these things that my father had kept all the days of his life. His post-war former concentration camp ID, a small diary, a calendar, a little notebook, and these photos, these small black and white photos, that in the displaced person camps, the prisoners, my father and the two in the middle, my understanding is they all somehow borrowed the jacket of the photographer. They're all wearing the same jacket because they had almost no clothes. Exchanged these photos, but when I turned them over, I saw these names that I'd heard about, that I had learned about in Poland, that we had written about in his memoir. Moses Zimin, Itzik Rip, Motek Hofstetter, Moses Tuchman, Tobias Newson, and all of a sudden they weren't just names anymore, they became real people. And so I started looking for them. I went back to the Alston archives and was shocked to discover this document, original document, that says 465 Hafling prisoners, Juden, Jews from Reichhof. My father's name, third from the bottom. I went back and started looking for his friends, people whose pictures he had, people who he had talked about, and I started finding them on the list, their names, their towns, their date of birth. They were with my father in all the camps. Each of them had these yellow Flossenburg possession cards, which were all, of course, blank because no one had any possessions. But they were signed by the prisoners, and I matched those to post-war cards I discovered that verified that they had been with my father in the 10 camps in ghetto and where they were going if they were leaving Poland, whether to New York or Sweden or Israel. So I got all this information and I started looking for them on Google, on Ancestry, on Facebook, in every way possible. I set out to find 7 of the names that my father had been with and spoken about and cared about, friends who had shared their bread and encouraged my father to stay alive every single day. And I found them all. Last November, we had a reunion in New Jersey where we zoomed in from Israel, from Sweden, from Texas. People came in from New York and New Jersey, and none of them knew the facts of their father's story. All of them had either kept silent, like my father had, or sadly, many had died as young fathers from terrible cancers, probably from the exposures to the salt mines, the stone quarries, the DDT, the chemicals, without proper protection. And so they all read my father's memoir, the 23rd Psalms, and found their father's names and stories, and indeed what they had been through with my father. I don't think that any of our fathers would have ever dreamed that someday we would all find each other and that we would become friends and create this bond of friendship and love and remembrance and all know what our fathers had been through together. I also found out what happened to my father's brother. I discovered through my research at Yad Vashem a post-war card that said, Monik Zaltzman, son of Herman, born in 1923 from Tichin, a student, was alive. This card is dated 1946. Then I went through the Shoah Foundation tapes, and I found a man living in Chicago, a survivor, whose 2 brothers had been with my father in the resistance in the woods. He had this picture of my father's brother after the war, and I had the one from before. He knew it was him. He swore it was him. He could tell he remembered him as a child with those funny ears. But after the war, my uncle and this man's brothers had gone looking for an infant baby girl that the sister who had not lived had left with a Polish woman. And they didn't want to give up the baby. And through a window, someone fired a gun, and my uncle was killed and left to die there in Poland in 1946. But at least my father took solace in knowing that he had tasted freedom and he had not died at the hands of the Nazis. A word about my mother. This photograph of her on the right was taken the night before she turned 100 years old. We had the hostage situation on a Saturday morning at Congregation Beth Israel, where my rabbi and dear friends were held hostage for 11 hours at the synagogue I founded. And that first Friday night was the first service that we were having at a community center because our building was terribly damaged. And she said, if you don't take me, I'm walking. So we went together, and Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker said to her, Ruth, tonight is a night of survivors. I learned more about my mother when I discovered that there was an American novelist writing 2 books based on her life. So I started searching for her, of course not her real name that I didn't know, and discovered this photo on the top left at the ghetto fighter's house in Israel, that she, after fleeing Poland from Tomasz Lubelski into Russia, refusing to be a citizen and arrested and put into a gulag in Siberia, after the war came back to Poland and joined the Bricha, which means escape. And she would go and help survivors cross the border, and her special job was to look for the orphans. 85% of all Jewish children were killed in the Holocaust, and they felt like it was their duty to find these children and try and reunite them with living family members, and if not, at least try and get them to Israel. So in this top left is her as an operative with the Bricha, with many, many, many famous people during that time. On the bottom left is one of 16 photos my mother, without telling me, early in my life, donated to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. This is her on the far left in the Cape, and these are the Jewish orphans that she helped find and collect standing in the woods. She was in Germany, in Poland, in Italy, in Czechoslovakia. And there's a picture of, what they would have to do just crossing the Alps. So my son, Aaron, here, is my co-author, and I have a favorite photo I share on another trip we took of my father and him walking together, walking in step in the Majdanek concentration camp. And what I imagine was having a conversation that I couldn't have with my father when I was growing up. And now we're producing a documentary film. Aaron is the producer, trying to bring to the next generation a new visual way to tell the story, with 2 and 3D animators and artists, original music score, and we're hoping and expecting that that will be out this spring. So yes, January 15th, we had this horrendous hostage situation, an anti-Semitic event, happened at my synagogue, where the gunman came all the way from England, thinking that Jews control the media, the press, and somehow if he would take some hostage, he would be able to secure the release of a domestic terrorist being held at the federal prison near Carswell Air Force Base, just maybe 30 minutes from our synagogue. I remember that I was in charge of the remodel, and after about 4 days, I was allowed in the building. And standing there in the lobby with the destroyed walls and the broken glass and the shot-out stained glass windows, it just gave me the same terrible feeling that I had experienced standing in the desecrated and empty synagogues in Poland. But we got it rebuilt, and after 3 months, we moved back in, and I just knew that we would not live in fear and we would not be defeated. I was asked to go and be a guest at the Senate confirmation hearing of Professor Deborah Lipstadt, now Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who's the U.S. envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And I went there in the Senate that day, and on one hand, I was so proud and excited. On the other hand, I was so sad to think that we need this kind of a position in our country. Who was my father? Lucien Zaltzman. When I look at one of his early photos taken in the displaced person camps, and I look at his self-portrait, I can't help but think that he was trying to tell his story even before he had the words. And when I look closer at that painting, I see, and I only saw this within the last year, I noticed, because it was shown in a magazine, that there's a person in the back wearing a yellow star with the number 222. That number is also in the little notebook that my father kept all those years. And under his name, he has written the name Joseph Singer, something he would not and could not forget, the name of that prisoner who ended up changing places, and maybe if they wouldn't have, it would have been my father who would have died. And a word about my grandmother. She was more than a woman who died in the gas chambers. Here you can see one of her letters that got out to America, tying in with such important work in the theme of this year, which is censorship, that a letter had gotten out, just a few, with the black heavy hand of the censors. And I learned from my father, finally, and from these letters, that she was a woman who sold and traded everything they owned in order to get some potatoes to feed her family. that she was a brave woman who went every day to plead with Christian judges and lawyers who had worked with my grandfather until she found some that were willing and helped secure his release, which we're so grateful for. And that she was the kind of loving and strong mother that even though my father pleaded to go with him on the boxcars and not be left alone in the ghetto, she convinced him to stay behind. Here, as he draws, just in a casual sketch of what that day felt like, when they thought that maybe if he stayed behind, it might be a chance for him to live. And he did. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your and your family's story. It just leaves us all speechless, I think. And so thank you for sharing the story. So we're going to go ahead and take questions from Anna. I've got a mic here. I'll probably be there in the aisle there. It's up to you. You can either come up to the mic or you can stay where you are, and I'll repeat them so that both everyone in the room can hear them, as well as those that are joining us online. So if anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand and we will...
Questions, comments,
Yes, yeah, feel free.
complaints?
Whatever you'd like to share.
Anna, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, in Judaism, we say that if you save one life, it's as though you've saved the entire world. And so I can't help but to have this overwhelming feeling of all the people that helped your dad survive. And then they didn't only save that one life, because now here you are, your son's here, and other family members. So have you thought about that? I mean, is that something that maybe is passed on to your kids? My son is here with me, and he's been with me to other Holocaust events and other stuff, but it's so important to continue to tell that story, because imagine what it does to future generations that continue to be offspring of somebody who survived because of other people's heroic acts.
I think that the Holocaust shows us the worst of humanity, but also among my father and his friends, we see the best of humanity. They offered each other hope and encouragement. They shared their soup, sometimes one bowl between two prisoners. They shared their bread. Prisoners. One time my father was taking a terrible beating, and he writes that it was a Norwegian prisoner who locked eyes with him. And just in that moment, my father was reminded that there was some compassion for him. And also in the factories and in the camps or in the towns, in the town of Colmar in France, when they were being marched through, and the people came out and stood on their balconies and called out and cried out, "Shame, shame," at the Germans. And the Germans, just made them stop taking off their caps, let them go a little bit without, the extreme brutality. But even in the factories and the camps, there may have been someone that gave him a piece of bread, let him rest for a moment in the cold. One time he was cleaning cars in a yard. They worked all day and night, and someone threw an apple over a wall. He doesn't even know who it was. But I think, the smallest things, we can't know how it can change or possibly save a life. And that's why for all of us, whenever we have an opportunity to be kind, to be gracious, to help, to care, to feel something, we have to do it. It is our obligation, and people need us.
Anna, thank you so much for your story. I was curious, and I don't know if you mentioned it, how old you were when you first saw the paintings. That's the first part of my question. The second part is, after all of that time of keeping that suppressed, and then all of a sudden, exploring, the past, those dark truths about what had happened, and the journey of healing that came with that, how that affected you and your father. I'm just, curious if you could kind of explain that.
So I was 7 or 8 when I found the paintings. I was very young, and it wasn't until I was 30 that I confronted my father. But I was learning on my own. It would have been better to learn together, for him and for me, because all of us in the house, carried grief and pain and questions, and we didn't know, and it was, I think, harder to go through alone. It did, of course, change me, but I wanted to know. It's a part of my history and my identity. And, it's difficult because in some ways I feel like the Holocaust has no bottom. When I read books and testimonies and hear stories and how it is passed down through the generations, and now it's the third generation, wanting to find out about their family history and the names and go back and visit. It is a history of trauma, intergenerational trauma and pain and loss. But it is our story, and if we do not protect it and keep it and learn and put it in the hands of other people, then we have to deal with all the distortion and denial that is going on now that, we must fight, because the truth and the history has lessons for all of us. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but.
Thank you for sharing. Your story is incredible. There's so many facets that are amazing. But when did you make the connection that those 2 pictures that you found were connected to World War II, and so that you could start doing that research?
Well, I think I was just an amazing child. No, I think when I found them, I'd already started hearing things about war or the camps, and I kind of knew, I just kind of had a feeling like this, why is this in our house? Why, and it wasn't long after, probably by middle school, that I was already starting to look around the library and read books. Books were such an important part of my learning about this, even though there weren't many. This is before Schindler's List, before museums. And I think it just kind of crept on me. I remember, telling one of my friends that my dad had been in a camp, my grandparents murdered, and her mother pulled me aside and said, "Don't ever speak of this again." So I think that people knew, and everyone felt for whatever reason that we needed to just not talk about it. Maybe it was too soon, too painful, I can't say. But once my father started speaking, and people would come up and say, "Thank you so much for telling your story, for inspiring us." And indeed, in the new version, which my son was one of the editors of, from one of his later speeches, I'll share this quickly. My father, I was there with him. We went to the first gathering of Holocaust survivors in Washington, D.C. Elie Wiesel was there. They announced the commission to start the museum. And later in a speech, my father said, I went to this gathering, of course, looking for people, and there would be none. And there was about 7,000 people there, maybe 5,000 Holocaust survivors and 2,000 children. 2,000 Holocaust survivors and 5,000 of their children. And my father said, if these people who had lived through such terrible things could somehow find the hope to create a new generation, then that was very meaningful. And at the end of the speech, my father said, if there are people who are going through difficulties in their life and they need some hope or need some inspiration, look to us. Look to us. So I think it kind of, gave him and made him realize it was important to give testimony and to encourage others. And he just was a kind and compassionate man. He never wanted to become like his captors, not angry, not bitter, not brutal. And that was an amazing thing, that a role model that we all have.
Over here. You can go ahead and share your question, and I'll repeat it.
Did your father know why it was only Jews that were being targeted during this time? And what was the hatred for just Jews and not any other religion?
That's such a good question. That's a good question.
Yep. Which
So-
I'm going to just quickly repeat so our folks
Sure.
online can catch it. And the question was, did your father know why it was the Jews that were targeted?
Well, anti-Semitism existed, way before World War II, World War I, the interwar period, maybe since the beginning of time. But it wasn't just the Jews, it was other people too. The original concentration camps in Germany were political prisoners. There were people there who were Freemasons. There were people there originally at Hadamar and the T4 who were euthanized because they had handicaps and disabilities. There were people there who were Roma and Sinti, previously called gypsies, no longer. There were people there who were homosexuals. There were priests who were hiding children in their convents. So the final solution and the purpose of the extermination camp was to kill the Jews, but the camps and many of the things happened to other people as well. More than 20 countries were occupied, and killing Jews was just one of Hitler's goals, as well as probably world domination.
Yep, we're just going to take a question from our online folks, quick.
Comment from our YouTube stream. I love your story and thank you for telling it and sharing the beautiful art your father created. It's a very important subject and a story to share with our kids as well. Did your father explain why he never spoke to you or your siblings about the Holocaust?
Yes, he did. He just said that, he wanted to try and live his life as if the Holocaust hadn't happened, to try and get an education and have a family, and they wanted to protect us. They thought it would be too painful and too hurtful. As a parent, I understood that. And then even growing up, the one picture of my grandparents, I remember I saw it hidden in my father's sock drawer. But I wouldn't ask him, who are these people? I didn't know who they were. But eventually, when I got to be older, we had many conversations, and I understood that he was trying to protect us, or maybe it was just too painful. There's a famous psychiatrist, Judith Herman, who wrote a book about trauma, and she said some things are so painful that they are unspeakable, but at the same hand, the truth cries out to be told. So I think it is that struggle, not to speak of things so terrible, to carry your pain alone, but as he writes in his book, we began to demand answers. And so it's the road that we travel together. There's one right.
Over here.
How old was your father when he started talking to you about the Holocaust?
Well, I was about 30, so he was probably in his 60s. I think that, from what I understand, my older brother, when he turned 13, it was about time for his bar mitzvah. They sat down and tried to talk to him about it, and it was very upsetting. And I think they decided not a good idea. So, of course, my brother never talked to us about it. Even to this day, sometimes we'll sit and share stories, and we each know different things. But when my father was in the 6th grade, he was called a dirty Jew and sent home from school. And when my son Aaron here was in 6th grade, he was called a dirty Jew in Texas. And it was very hard to tell my father that, but Aaron won where was it out of? Houston, the state Holocaust essay contest. And it just kind of launched into the understanding that we can take this. And I remember my father saying, this is a very different outcome from what happened. And one of the things is that during the time, before we had a building for our synagogue and after the SWAT operation, and our building was destroyed, we met at churches. And I would say to some of the ministers who know me well, this is such an act of redemption. Never during the Holocaust would this happen. And you welcome us in. As a matter of fact, the head minister of a Methodist church would come on Friday night and be the usher. And so there was such an outpouring of support and loving kindness within the community that, again, we can all learn to do better.
I gather that your father was alive during much of your research into his past. And so I'm just wondering what that process of sharing back the discoveries with him was like. Were there particular items that he was most astonished by or seemed to move him the most?
Well, actually, he died in 2016, so he was alive when I discovered his brother Monik. and those documents, and we looked everywhere for him. I mean, we did searches with the Red Cross, Yad Vashem, the museums. We wrote to survivor organizations in Canada, Shanghai. I mean, we looked worldwide to be like, where could he have gone? And, you know, and then I came upon the fact that he had been shot and killed. And my father did communicate with that baby girl who now lives in Chicago and is a grown woman. But all of the rest of this, the Olson documents, the lists, the reunion happened after my father passed away. There was one man left in New York who was with my father in some of the camps. I don't know if I don't think they knew each other, but who knows? And so I'm going to go and meet him as soon as it's less cold in New York. But yeah, he didn't really know about this. And he did not give me those photographs in the diary. They were just in a folder in his house. He didn't ever speak of them and share them. And when COVID started and I brought my mother in to live with us and we sold her house, that's when we took possession of the things and discovered so much about him that we didn't know. And I actually didn't even know my mother was 100 till probably about a year ago, when she kept kind of, you know, revising her birth year. But then I have recently found her documents that she had false papers that says she was a blonde Jew from Berlin, and with different names, different parents. And she was afraid her whole life in America to tell the truth, you know, that she could have collected Social Security much earlier. But it was just, I think it's just pain. It's human pain that can do that, to make you keep secrets and bury things. So I think we've got the books that a lovely independent bookseller has been gracious enough to come. I'm happy to sign them if you want to get them. Keep your fingers crossed. Pillar of Salt is up for American Library Association Award next Monday. And we're excited that Pillar of Salt just got approved by the Texas Holocaust Commission. San Antonio, responsible for this mandate. Whoa, sorry. So definitely want to make note of that, because it's changing things all over the state of Texas, and that came out of here, these incredible people and organizations, the museum, thank you so much, and the library. But we're just at the beginning, I think, of a lot of opportunities and change to further Holocaust education. And so I thank you for your support and partnering and collaborating. And there's bookmarks, if you don't want a book, that have my email and website. There's a teaser for the film. And we're going to, last week I spoke at the 5th largest church in America. So we are partnering with Catholic churches, all different denominations, and it's really where we have to go to try and bring these messages of more kindness, more love. So they're very interested, and also with schools. Today we were in Pleasanton, spoke to 1,000 kids. So thank you to the San Antonio Holocaust Museum and all the sponsors who are here tonight. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your story. As Anna mentioned, there are books for sale, so feel free to check those out. We also still have plenty of refreshments, so please help yourself, take some home, whatever you'd like. Just wanted to quickly share that, we did live stream it tonight, so if you want to view it later or share it with a friend or school or whoever you'd like to share tonight's program with, you are welcome to do so. We also will be posting, we have one so far posted of our speakers throughout the month. We had 3 speakers this month. And so those recordings will be posted on the library's YouTube channel as well. So if you want to share those, you can share those as well. One is posted already, and the other 2 should be posted within the next week or so. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and have a wonderful evening.